हे करे
चालू झाले.
आज आपण आपले अत्यंत जवळचे मित्र सतीश काळसेकर यांच्या स्मृतीला अभिवादन करण्यासाठी आपण इथे जमलेले आहोत. मी या कार्यक्रमामध्ये आपल्यासोबत विद्या काळसेकर आहेत, विप्लव आदित्य आहेत आणि आजच्या या कार्यक्रमासाठी म्हणून आपण ज्यांना आमंत्रित केलं ते जगामधले एक अत्यंत प्रख्यात विचारवंत, ज्यांचा मार्क्सवादी म्हणून सगळीकडे मोठा नावलौकिक झालेला आहे आणि ज्यांच्या विचाराबद्दल आणि वक्तव्यासाठी आपण नेहमीच उत्सुक असतो, जे आपल्याला मार्गदर्शक ठरतात. असे ज्येष्ठ विचारवंत एजाज अहमद साहेब उपस्थित आहेत. दिल्लीचे सुधन्वा देशपांडे हे उपस्थित आहेत आणि सर्व सहकारी मित्रांनो, सतीश काळसेकरच्या स्मृतीला अभिवादन करण्यासाठी म्हणून हा आपण 4 दिवसांचा स्मृती जागर आयोजित केलेला आहे. 24 जुलैला पहाटे अत्यंत अचानक असं धक्कादायक सतीशचं निधन झालं आणि त्या निधनाची बातमी कळताच सर्व भाषिक आणि भौगोलिक सीमा ओलांडत वेगवेगळ्या ठिकाणी असणारे त्याचे सन्मित्र वाचक यांच्यावरती एक दुःखाची आणि विषण्णतेची छाया पसरली. लोक एकमेकांशी त्याच्याबद्दल भरभरून बोलत राहिले. अनेकांनी अनेक माध्यमांच्या मध्ये लेख लिहून सतीशला अभिवादन केलं. अनेक ठिकाणी अभिवादनाच्या सभा झालेल्या आहेत, होत आहेत, होत राहतील. या सगळ्या पार्श्वभूमीवर आपण काही मित्रांनी एकत्र येऊन ही एक अनौपचारिक सभा इथं आपण आयोजित केलेली आहे. आपल्याला माहिती आहे, कोविडची बंधनं असल्यामुळे आपल्या सर्वांना प्रत्यक्ष भेटता येत नाही, परंतु या इंटरनेटच्या माध्यमामुळे, त्या महाजालामुळे आपण दूर दूर असलेले सगळे एकत्र येऊ शकतो आणि याच्या विशाल मित्र समुदायानं ही सभा भरवलेली आहे. ही सभा भरवत असताना सतीश काळसेकर यांनी गेली 40-50 वर्ष जो संवाद अव्याहतपणे चालू ठेवला, तो संवाद पुढेही चालू राहावा या हेतूनं आपण एक त्यांना अभिवादन देणारा कार्यक्रम करूया, अशा पद्धतीचा विचार आला आणि आपण हा संवाद चालू करतोय. हा मैत्रभाव हा सतीशच्या जीवनाचा गाभा होता आणि सतीश काळसेकर आपल्या एका कवितेत म्हणतात त्याप्रमाणे त्यांनी चिमण्या आणि निवडुंगांशी सारखाच मैत्रभाव जोडून ठेवलेला होता आणि हा मैत्रभाव हा त्यांच्या संवादाचा फार मोठा पाया होता आणि त्याच हेतूनं आपण ही सभा आज आयोजित करतो. अनेक कवी लेखक आपापल्या विशिष्ट शैलीचं, प्रवाहांचं, साहित्य प्रवाहांचं, कला प्रवाहांचं प्रतिनिधित्व करतात. पण हा मनुष्य सतीश काळसेकर एका कुठल्याही विशिष्ट प्रवाहामध्ये बंदिस्त न होता त्या प्रवाहामध्ये राहत राहत इतर अनेक प्रवाहांना आपलंसं करत एक अथांग अशा पद्धतीचे व्यक्तिमत्व तो जगला. 60-70 लिटल मॅगझिन पासून ते 2020-21 पर्यंत लिहित आलेले सर्वजण जे आहेत, असे लेखक आहेत, वाचक आहेत, त्यांच्यापर्यंत तो पसरला आणि आजूबाजूचं सगळं जग हर तऱ्हाने विखंडित होत असताना ते सर्व तुकडे जोडायचं काम ते करत राहिले. त्यांच्याच भाषेत बोलायचं झालं तर प्रेमाच्या अखंड सिम्फनीत जगणारा हा मनुष्य होता आणि त्या सिम्फनीमध्ये तो अनेक लोकांना एकत्र करत राहिला. ही भावना व्यक्त करण्यासाठीच आपण ही आजची अभिवादन सभा आयोजित केलेली आहे. ही सभा आज 2 ऑगस्ट पासून 5 ऑगस्ट पर्यंत रोज संध्याकाळी 6 वाजता भरेल. काल 1 ऑगस्टला सतीश काळसेकरांचे आवडते लेखक शाहीर कॉम्रेड अण्णाभाऊ साठे यांची जन्मशताब्दी पूरी झाली आणि त्याच्या दुसऱ्या दिवशी आपण हा आदरांजलीचा कार्यक्रम करूया असा विचार आला आणि आज आपण हा कार्यक्रम सुरू करत आहोत. हा कार्यक्रम सुरू करत असताना कुणाच्या विचाराचा हात धरून पुढे जावं असा विचार आमच्या मनामध्ये आला आणि सर्वांनाच प्राध्यापक एजाज अहमद यांची आठवण झाली. त्यांच्या वक्तव्यानं आणि त्यांच्या विचारानं या कार्यक्रमाचं ची सुरुवात व्हावी ही अत्यंत उचित गोष्ट सर्वांना वाटली आणि आपण सर्वांनी एजाज अहमद यांना या कार्यक्रमासाठी बोलवलेलं आहे. वी वेलकम यू एजाज साहब, आप बहुत दूर से आए.
थैंक यू वेरी मच.
आप अब अमेरिका से आप हमसे बात कर रहे हैं और हम आपकी बात सुनने को बहुत वेरी ईगर टू हियर यू. एजाज साहेबांच्या भाषणाचा विषय आहे जो त्यांनी आपल्याला सुचवलेला आहे. आय कांट ब्रीथ इज अ ग्लोबल कंडिशन. मला असं वाटतं की सतीश काळसेकरच्या स्मृतीला अभिवादन करत असताना याच्या इतका अत्यंत उचित अशा पद्धतीचा विषय हा असणार नाही. आपले मित्र गणेश विस्पुते यांनी त्याचं मराठीमध्ये अत्यंत सुंदर असं भाषांतर केलेलं आहे. आय कांट ब्रीथ इज अ ग्लोबल कंडिशन. माझी घुसमट एक जागतिक महावाक्य असं त्यांनी त्याचं भाषांतर केलेलं आहे. एजाज साहेब बोलतील त्यानंतर त्याच्या पूर्वी एजाज साहेब बोलण्यापूर्वी त्यांची ओळख लेफ्टवर्डचे संपादक आणि दिल्लीतील जननाट्य मंचचे नाट्यकर्मी सुंदरवा देशपांडे हे करून देतील. हा कार्यक्रम झाल्यानंतर उद्या 3 ऑगस्ट रोजी सतीश काळसेकर आणि लघुनियतकांची चळवळ परिसंवाद संध्याकाळी 6 वाजता आपण आयोजित केलेला आहे. त्यात सतीश काळसेकरांचे समकालीन लेखक आणि मित्र चंद्रकांत पाटील, ज्येष्ठ कवी आणि कार्यकर्ते अर्जुन डांगळे, ज्येष्ठ संपादक आणि विचारवंत कुमार केतकर आणि देश विदेशामध्ये ज्यांनी आपल्या लेखनानं नाव केलेले असे आपले ज्येष्ठ लेखक भालचंद्र नेमाडे हे त्यामध्ये सहभागी होतील. या कार्यक्रमाचे नियोजन समीक्षक नितीन त्रिंढे, कवी आणि कादंबरीकार प्रवीण बांदेकर आणि समीक्षक रणधीर शिंदे यांनी केलेलं आहे. त्यानंतर 4 ऑगस्टला मराठी हिंदी भाषेमधील सोडले नाही कवितेने हे काव्य संमेलन आपण आयोजित करतो. राजेश जोशींच्या पासून ते विकास पालवे पर्यंत, तरुण कवींच्या पर्यंत अनेक ज्येष्ठ कवी, तरुण कवी त्यामध्ये सहभागी होत आहेत. स्वतः सतीश काळसेकर यांच्या देखील कविता त्यामध्ये सादर केल्या जात आहेत. सतीश काळसेकरांचे जिवलग मित्र जयप्रकाश सावंत, कवी प्रफुल्ल शिलेदार आणि गणेश विस्पुते यांनी या कार्यक्रमाचे नियोजन केलेले आहे. त्यानंतर शेवटच्या दिवशी 5 ऑगस्टला अभिवादन सभा होईल. त्यामध्ये सतीश काळसेकरांचे ज्येष्ठ सुहृद, मराठी हिंदी भाषेमधील अनेक कवी, लेखक, राजकीय कार्यकर्ते त्यामध्ये सहभागी होत आहेत. या कार्यक्रमाचे नियोजन सुप्रसिद्ध कवयित्री प्रज्ञादया पवार, सामाजिक कार्यकर्त्या डॉक्टर मेघा पानसरे आणि मार्क्सवादी सांस्कृतिक चळवळीतील ज्येष्ठ कार्यकर्ते सुबोध मोरे यांनी केलेले आहे. तेव्हा आता जास्त वेळ न घेता मी प्राध्यापक एजाज अहमद यांचं पुढचं भाषण सुरू करण्याच्या दृष्टीनं सुधन्वा देशपांडे यांना मी विनंती करेन की त्यांनी एजाज अहमद यांचा परिचय आपल्याला करून द्यावा सुरुवातीलाच आपल्या सर्वांना विनंती आहे की एजाज अहमद यांचं भाषण झाल्यानंतर काही महत्वाच्या प्रश्नांना एजाज साहेब उत्तर देतील, त्यामध्ये ते चर्चा करतील. तर सर्वांना विनंती आहे की ज्यांना प्रश्न विचारायचे आहेत त्यांनी चॅट बॉक्समध्ये आपले प्रश्न विचारावेत आणि मग प्रश्नोत्तरांचा कार्यक्रम झाल्यानंतर आपले एक संयोजक श्रीपाद भालचंद्र जोशी हे आभार मानतील. मी सुधन्वा देशपांडे यांना विनंती करतो की त्यांनी आपले प्रमुख पाहुणे प्राध्यापक एजाज अहमद यांचा परिचय करून द्यावा. सुधन्वा देशपांडे.
Thank you very much, Comrade Uday. It's my great privilege and honor to have been asked to join the meeting today in memory of Comrade Satish Karsekar, who I admired for a long time as a poet and I should also say as a publisher. I will not speak about Comrade Karsekar because there are, the next 3-4 days are devoted to celebrating his work, his memory, and so on. I'm not even going to actually try and introduce Professor Aijaz Ahmad. I'm just going to show you 3 of his books that have made a huge impact on me and my life. I first encountered Professor Aijaz Ahmad's work, his writings, through journals such as the EPW and Social Scientist and others. And the first book that I read of his is this one, In Theory, Classes, Nations, Literatures. And this has been a book that I've returned to many, many times over the last, almost 30 years, because I think I read this book for the first time in 1993, if I remember correctly. And since then, I've returned to this book really several times. I must have read this book about 7-8 times maybe. And it's something that always gives me a lot to think about. After that, in 1996, when I was working at Tulika, I worked as an editor on this book, which is called Lineages of the Present, Political Essays, now sadly out of print. But this book then puts together some of the essays that I had read in EPW and other places, but also a whole lot of essays that I was not familiar with, including his essays on Iran and so on. And then year before last, 2018, 2019, I think, my friend Vijay Prashad and Mauloishri Hashmi and I, the 3 of us traveled to the US and we spent 4 absolutely scintillating days with Professor Aijaz Ahmad. And the result of those 4 days is contained in this book, Nothing Human is Alien to Me, Aijaz Ahmad in conversation with Vijay Prashad. And I would really strongly recommend all the listeners today, all those who are in the audience, to get a copy of this book, because this really, in a sense, it encapsulates the intellectual and political journey that Professor Aijaz Ahmad has undertaken over these several years. And much later in life, I also read his the book that he's put together of translations of Ghalib. And I was actually quite stunned when I read the introduction to that book, to realize that he was actually really young when he wrote that. Because I've only encountered him as a fully, as a fully formed intellectual in a sense. And it was fascinating to read that introduction and the translations. I'm not going to say anything more except to just quote the first line of Vijay Prashad's introduction to this book, which is, "It is impossible for me to think without thinking alongside the work of Aijaz Ahmad." And what Vijay says about Aijaz Ahmad, it is impossible for me to even think except alongside the work of Aijaz Ahmad. I think this really defines my own relationship to his writing and thinking as well. And I think for lots of us who have spent the last 30 odd years reading Aijaz Saab, and listening to him. And so it's a great pleasure today to once again be able to hear Professor Aijaz Ahmad. I can't breathe is a global condition, and I'm absolutely sure that it's going to be a scintillating evening for all of us. Over to you, Aijaz sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction, Sudhana. And thank you, everyone, especially Comrade Udayanathkar, for having invited me to this. I'm actually very honored that I've been invited to speak in memory of the late Mr. Satish Kaleskar. Unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to meet him personally, nor do I know Marathi. I'm therefore unable to read his writings. I've heard of him only by reputation and by hearsay as an eminent and much honored figure in modern Marathi literature, as an editor, as an activist of progressive causes, and so on, an illustrious personality. I'm not going to spend any time speculating about him secondhand, because I really don't have any firsthand knowledge of him. So I speak here in his memory as an act of solidarity and salutation. Solidarity with all of you, and particularly with the memory of Mr. Satish Kaleskar. Salutation to him as someone who has had very similar commitments as him. So now a word about today's topic. I can't breathe is a global condition. I had been given a tentative title, which I didn't particularly like. And so I said to Sudharma, said, you pick your own title. And I told him, I said, look, I'm not very good at titles. So he gave me 4 titles, possible titles, and I elected one of them. So it's partly my title, partly not, which is just as well, which is how things should be. So, now this phrase itself has a history. It first surfaced in 2014 when a young Black man, Eric Garner by name, was killed by a white policeman in New York City through what Americans call chokehold, going like this and using that to strangulate you. So he was strangulated. And as he was being strangulated, he kept saying, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. Apparently, research shows that 70 different Black men being killed by white policemen have used this phrase as the last words they spoke before dying. Most recently, the phrase came up when George Floyd, another young Black man, was killed similarly by a white policeman in the United States, who put his knee on Floyd's neck for 9.5 minutes and killed him thereby. And during those 9.5 minutes, he kept saying, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And this was in public. There were quite a lot of people there. The whole thing was recorded on camera, etc. That came in the middle of the movement that has been going on in the United States for quite some time, called Black Lives Matter. Cumulatively, it is probably the largest anti-racist movement in the history of the United States. It is Black Lives Matter, the movement which took up the slogan, "I can't breathe," as a collective slogan. And because of the international impact of Black Lives Matter movement, the phrase came to be known internationally and particularly in Europe, and has been used in countless anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist mobilizations and agitations and demonstrations and so on. So, the phrase "I can't breathe" has come to have two very different meanings. One, the sheer brutality of the oppressive systems that do not let you live and who deprive you of even speech, to the point where the only words you can say is to beg for your life. "I can't breathe, let me live." And on the other hand, it has become the slogan of mass movements, protests, resistance, both nationally in the United States and globally, against imperialism and capitalism. So it's a two-edged phrase now. It no longer is just a protest, just a moment of oppression. It is also, the other face of it is the moment of resistance. So that's the sort of short history of the phrase. But what does it mean to say "I cannot breathe" is a global condition? And that is what I'll be talking about mostly. And what I want to do is to reflect with you on the kind of times we are living in globally, and of course nationally, in India. India, in the kind of times that we are living in, what is going on in India is by no means unique to India. It is itself part of what is going on globally. That is to say, we are living in a time where far-right politics has taken hold of state systems of the great majority of the countries, certainly the most powerful ones, with the exception of China and Russia probably. Great majority of the countries in the world, certainly in Western capitalist countries. And yet, it is a time when, the word fascism is used for what is going on in the world, and particularly in India. And as you well know, there have been very important debates and discussions in India on the question of whether India has gone fascist, whether it is going fascist, etc. My position on this has been that no, India is not going fascist, no country is going fascist. By which I do not mean that we live in conditions that are necessarily better than fascism or short of fascism. We are living in times which are perhaps, globally speaking, much worse than the period of fascism. I only mean that we are living in a period that is very, very different. And it must be understood in its difference and originality. What is specific to these times cannot be comprehended by way of analogy with a period of time in European history 120 years ago or something like that. This is a completely different kind of conjecture. And I want to talk about that a little bit before coming back to the question of India. Overall, I think that the character of this time has been determined, over-determined, by the defeat of the communist state system and the dismemberment of the communist countries, by which I mean the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, European countries, the Warsaw Pact countries. This is the first time in history, very first time in history, that capitalism has become an absolutely global system. It has never been. It is only with the dissolution of the Soviet bloc that it became a uniformly global system. It is a time in which the period of fascism, however brutal it was, first of all, fascism was limited to a few countries of Europe and some of the most powerful countries in the world, the Soviet Union, United States, and Britain, did not go fascist. France was occupied by them and so on, but it was a regional, a local phenomenon, a very powerful phenomenon, a phenomenon which was saved, from which the world was saved, primarily by the Soviet Union through a sacrifice of some 22 million of its citizens. So the sacrifice of overthrowing the fascist system was very great, but there were forces outside the fascist system, primarily the Soviet Union, but also were at that time the two major liberal democratic countries, if you want to call them that, the two major imperialist countries, if you want to call them that, that is to say the United States and the United Kingdom. There were forces outside the world of fascism which could fight back. There was a country called the Soviet Union which fought for 5-6 years, defeated Nazis at great cost to itself, but defeated. And in fact, that defeat led to a new wave of revolutions in Eastern Europe and China. On that one count, that is not the kind of world we are living. I'll come back to that. Secondly, fascism was both a particular kind of European phenomenon in which for about 200 years there had been a struggle between the reactionary forces of monarchy, dictatorship, etc., the revolution and the counter-revolution from the French Revolution on to the Bolshevik Revolution. So, the fascism arose in a condition where communism in Europe itself, in Germany, in Italy, in a number of European countries, a communist revolution was possible. And it is in the countries where communist movement was the most powerful that fascism arose to defeat the communist movement at home. That is to say, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, 4 countries where communist movements were very, very powerful. The labor movement generally was very, very powerful. So there was a direct political contention between two political systems. And Nazis and the fascists came to power not by consensus, not through liberal democratic structures, but through great violence, repression, great repression. Neither of those two things really exist in our time. Labor movement across the world is very much on the defensive. You don't have to have fascist violence, mass fascist violence, to fight against the workers' movement. I'll also come to that, including India. And the other thing is that fascism came to power through sheer violence, and the first thing it did when it came to power was that it abolished all semblance of liberal democracy. And of course, mass murder of communists and the labor movements generally. Today, the peculiarity that we have, and India is very much there in this, and I'll come to that. The peculiarity that you have is that forces that resemble the fascists, the far-right forces, have taken power and are maintaining power through liberal democratic systems, through constitutional institutions, general elections. In India, you still have the constitution, you have multi-party system, you have elections, you have a Supreme Court, you have a judiciary. Now, these institutions are being hollowed out, and we'll talk about that. But that the structure of constitutionality, the institutional structure of liberal democracy is intact, and there is absolutely no rhetoric in the RSS or analogous movements in other countries like the United States, Germany, and so on, against liberalism. So what you have actually is a historically new kind of state emerging as a universal form of capitalist rule in our time, which combines the characteristics of a liberal order and characteristics of a fascist order. It takes elements from fascism. Fascism has always been an element. I mean, since 1880s, I would argue, fascism has been an element in bourgeois rule always. But now what you have is that the institutions of bourgeois democracy are kept intact, but hollowed out from within. This is a very different kind of order, where the judiciary exists, sometimes acts independently, but by and large acts as an arm of the executive. This is a very different kind of situation. You have political parties, liberal bourgeois political parties, which have been subjugated. You have an extraordinary situation in which the mess that the BJP RSS government has made of the economy, of health situation, the utter mess on every front. An economy that is completely hollowed out, which has no basis. In the World Hunger Index, involving 117 countries. India is 112. Mass starvation is an endemic condition. Even our neighbors in South Asia, each one of them has a higher position on this. And at the same time, our media is full of how successful our economy is, and not only national media, world media. They're trying to pretend that India and China are somehow economic competitors, as if India has sort of arrived where China has arrived. It's it's absolutely bizarre proposition. And yet, despite all of these economic problems in the country, there is no opposition. And there is no opposition that challenges the very premises of the ruling dispensation. When the ruling dispensation abrogates unconstitutionally its commitments to the state of Jammu and Kashmir, by and large, every bourgeois party falls in line with them. They're afraid that if they oppose them, national sentiments, etc., etc. On issues like the way they have handled the question of the epidemic. India is the world's largest producer of vaccines, historically. What the numbers are, it's very hard to tell. The best estimates are that the numbers are about 10 to 30 times as bad as what the government says. There is no opposition that has any coherent position on any of this, on demonetization, this, that, and the other. They have subjugated the opposition parties themselves. Which means that the left in India is much more isolated than it has ever been, because the liberal center has collapsed. You only have the far right occupying the liberal position, by which I mean ruling through liberal democratic institutions. Now, I want to say that I don't have much respect for the word liberal. So when I say liberal democratic institutions, I actually am not praising those institutions. Liberalism is the real enemy for the left. Far right used to be really just far right, the real struggles. So, so you have this kind of situation in which they do not need fascism. They would do it if they needed it. They're quite capable of killing hundreds of thousands of people. I'm not saying that they are intrinsically different. RSS is, in my view, a kind of a far-right political organization, far bigger, far worse than anything history has ever known. American Republican Party is now beginning to compete with the RSS. I don't know which one is the greater danger to the world, but these are the two most vicious political organizations in the world, and extremely well organized. And yet, fascism is not what they need. That is, the violence will be calibrated, is calibrated, it is constant, it is low level, and it is exemplary. That is to say, you can kill Mr. Gaurian and Kesh, Comrade Pansare, Gulbergi, whoever, eminent people of reason, whose only crime is to stand for reason and truth. You can kill them as exemplary killings. Great majority of the people they hope will be silenced through these exemplary killings. The Bhima Karegaon case is exemplary. This is what we can do to you, each one of you. This is terror through setting of examples, and it's calibrated. And it is carried out through institutions of liberal democracy. It is state police, central intelligence organizations, high courts, even Supreme Courts, where it is known that evidence was planted through spyware or whatever, where there are no cases, and yet the courts do what they are told by the executive to do. This is a very different kind of system. And that has to do with the collapse of the liberal center. We no longer have in India a liberal polity, liberal political parties. There is no methodical opposition. There used to be a time when political parties used to argue programmatically. No longer is the case. And again, this is not only India. It is all over the world. The two political parties, the Labour Party that now you have in England and the Tories, do not programmatically disagree with each other. When Corbyn came to head the Labour Party, he was destroyed because he had stepped out of the liberal consensus and had talked about a progressive alternative within the liberal democratic system. You are no longer allowed now to actually present a progressive alternative, a labor-friendly alternative, shall we say, within the liberal order. You'll be destroyed. Sanders in America was destroyed by the Democratic Party. Mélenchon, who came in from the left, again, he was an old Socialist Party person. He was by no means a revolutionary or communist or anything like that. But he was destroyed by the Socialist Party, by the whole gang of political parties, because he had a labor-friendly stance. Across the Western world, and this is very, you have to think about it, that had this system not been fixed the way it has been fixed, the three leading Western countries, United States, France, and United States, could have had a labor-friendly, relatively progressive government had there been a free election. And yet they were not suppressed through terror or anything like that, but by the working of the liberal democratic system. The other thing, when you say I can't breathe, this kind of terror that you are witnessing in India has now become completely common in liberal democratic countries. Not only that, the other side of it is the extremity of capitalism in our time. Everything that colonized nations and the working classes had gained over a century of revolutions, what Eric Hobsbawm calls the short 20th century, that is to say, the century that lasted from 1917 to 1989. That's really the 20th century. All the gains that were made have been taken back systematically, country after country after country. And the conditions of the working class, even in the advanced capitalist countries, are beginning to resemble what Engels wrote about in 1840s in his book on the British working class, the seminal book in the American Marxist sociological analysis of capitalist societies. You have that extremity. And so the sort of a relative welfare state that had been built in the West under pressure of communism has been dismantled. Social democracy was essentially in Western Europe. Social democracy was the method through which communist pressure was to be contained. If you didn't have social democracy, you had the threat of communist revolution. So in some of the social democratic countries at that time, of the 1970s, early 1980s, something like 80% of the value added was returned to the working class. Profits were that narrow. That was under pressure of communism. It's really in 1978 that even the prospect of a communist revolution in Western Europe finally disappeared with the election in Italy and the failure of the revolution in Portugal. Once the communist state system had been defeated, the West did not need social democracy. And social democratic welfare state systems were dismantled all over Europe. At the end of the Second World War, which coincided with the rise of the Chinese Revolution, Americans came in and occupied South Korea and Japan and Taiwan and so on, and told them all to carry out the most radical land reforms if they were not going to go to the way of China. The great beneficiaries of the Chinese Revolution were the peasantries of Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and so on. So there were enormous gains made, not only by people who came to live under social systems, but people who lived in other countries where revolutionary possibility existed. That is being eliminated. So the most extreme kind of capitalism now exists in all these countries. Then what has happened with the defeat of communism is that the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, had the world's best trained, healthiest, most educated working class, which was then protected by the socialist system. once that system is dismantled, that working class is made available to global capital. And as this immense working class, well-educated, well-trained, healthy, became available to global capital, global wage rates collapsed. The conditions of the working class, the ability of the working class to negotiate with capital, which is essentially what social democracy was, which is essentially what Nehruvian state in India was. The ability of the working class to have some negotiating capacity with capital. That sort of that became impossible. So when I took from Sudanbab the title I Cannot Breathe is a Global Condition, I actually had this in my mind. And then there is something else which is connected with this not being able to breathe, which has to do with freedom of speech. I want to, how much time do I have? 5 minutes, 10 minutes.
10 minutes for sure.
You can take as much as you want.
About speech. We greatly valorize the idea of freedom of speech. First thing I want to say is that there's no such thing as freedom of speech. Total freedom of speech. This is a totally American libertarian idea. Fact of the matter is that all our societies have restrictions on what can or cannot be said in public. To the extent to which, I mean, the French, for example, have been passing laws against anti-Semitic speech. Indian constitution, Indian legal system says that religion cannot be used to for political purposes. It is used all the time, but it's illegal. They should all be, according to the law, they should all be in prison. There are always restrictions to what you can say. And they're very complicated philosophical theories about that, which I won't get into. In India, there's an enormous freedom of speech. Enormous. It's just astounding. The RSS can say anything. The entire RSS front media, Godi media, it's called, or the WhatsApp University, as Ravish Kumar called it. Those people have enormous freedom. They can say anything. They can stand in the middle of the road and call for murder. इन देश के गद्दारों को गोली मारो सारो, और भी जाके गोली मारते हैं. और बीजेपी का मिनिस्टर है जो कह रहा, this is our daily routine. Extreme freedom of speech for the right. Restrictions for freedom on speech are on progressive speech. There's no freedom of progress or shrinking freedom of progressive speech. The exemplary murders of people like Comrade Pansari and so on, that is silencing of progressive, rationalist, progressive speech. So when we talk about freedom of speech, we have to ask whose freedom of speech and what kind of speech for which you want freedom. That's one sort of thing. The other thing that has happened in terms of speech is that you're no longer living in that 19th century world in which speech or writing a pamphlet or saying something in a newspaper was speech, speech in the public sphere. That was a speech in the public sphere. Modern technologies have made that notion of speech absolutely redundant. When you have the speech that in fact is the most influential, which in fact tells people what to think, comes to them from television, comes to them from social media, and it is the volumes of it are increasing at a level in which at any given point the IT cell of the BJP can send out 60,000, 70,000, 90,000 Twitter things from 90,000 Twitter accounts. One of the results of it, which is very fundamental for the kind of society capitalism of our time has produced, is the erasure of the line between rational speech and irrational speech. Factual speech, speech that is verifiable in any way, and speech that is not verifiable. Where who says determines the truth. There's some 70% of the American, 70% of the Republicans believe that Trump had actually won the elections. And there's nothing you can do about it. You're seeing this in India in terms of Modi can fail in every single possible way by which you judge governments, and nothing happens. Because of the social media, the Godi media, etc. Rational and irrational. For the first time in 200 years, globally, the balance has shifted against rationality towards irrationality. In politics, in religion, in speech, mass communications, Goebbels had no idea what propaganda was. He could not have had because he didn't have the means. Today's media, today's media through which propaganda can be carried out in all kinds of open, all kinds of even subliminal ways, is of a completely different order. It's one of the 3 or 4 greatest dangers to modern society. This falling away of standards of truth, of factuality. This is how, you see it all the time, the way, let's say, the Muslims are represented by the RSS, or Bhima Karegaon people are represented in the media and by the police, etc., etc. You also have a situation in which documentary evidence exists, visual documentary evidence exists, against which all kinds of claims can be made by the authorities, which will then prevail in the institutions of liberal democracy. So I think this thing of not being able to breathe has all kinds of connotations. The level of just sheer cruelty, daily life of sheer mass cruelty. Forget about RSS, communalism, this, that, and the other. Just what they have done with the pandemic. Just what they have done with the farmers' movement, which is much less. I mean, the idea that these are Khalistanis, who are running this movement. These are pro-Pakistanis. These are anti-nationals. They are Tukde gang. This is what you're calling the farmers. And for more than a year, they have been there in and around the capital, ignored, completely ignored, for the sake of those 3 laws in favor of the corporate sector. And the way these things become normal, how the country goes on and on while these things accumulate. So there is, I think, a very great social crisis. It's not just the state is like this. The state couldn't be like this if there was not a very great fundamental social crisis in India. I've already talked far too long. Thank you very much. I don't want to go into now what I mean by the social crisis, because that'll take me another half. Thank you very, very much for inviting me. It was a great pleasure for me to do this act of solidarity and adulation for the late comrade. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Aijaz, we already have some questions coming in the chat box. There are 2 questions already there. I don't know if you can see them, but let me just read them out because...
The problem is that my chat box has 8 questions. Some of them are probably from a long time ago. Oh, no. There's Vineet Tiwari to everyone, Shruti Tambe to everyone, and so on. Which one?
So I'll just read out both the questions because the questions will not appear on...
There are lots of questions, yeah.
On Facebook and YouTube and so on. They won't be able to see the questions. So that's why let me just read them out for the benefit of our viewers there. Shruti Tambe says, excellent exposition of the theme. May I ask you also to comment on one aspect, the calculated deafening silence of the upper middle class and middle class who have now gained through liberalization. Earlier, they were the leaders of protest and discontent. In the US, in the UK, it is not the same authors, academics, journalists, and advocates, etc., who are doing that anymore. Vineet Tiwari says, and can we also know from you what is happening in the countries and societies which have not succumbed to capitalism, like Cuba, DPRK, and China? So these are the two concrete questions we have, and of course there are other comments. And I'm hoping that we will get more questions. I can see some people jotting them down, but in the meanwhile, if you want to respond to these 2.
Yes, and I'll try to be as brief as possible, because both of these questions, each of them, I could go on for 10, 15 minutes. I'll try to be as brief as possible. The first question about the class. What has happened? This is the kind of capitalism that I was talking about. You now have a class, a dominant class. Let's call it the bourgeoisie, which has really what neoliberalism and all these various kinds of policies of extreme accumulation have done is that you have all over the world, in India, United States, in Europe, a bonanza of billionaires in a period of extreme economic hardship. Likewise, there is in the upper middle classes an enormous mobility. The kind of wealth that the upper levels of the middle classes in India now have, there's never been this kind of wealth in the past. And that national compact upon which the Nehruvian state was based, forget about the actual failure of those policies, or not only just failure, even bad conscience about those. But in principle, there was said to be a national compact, some kind of an idea of a nation in which the greed of the wealthiest would be controlled, the needs of the poorest would somehow be met a little more than would be otherwise. The bridge between the poor and the rich will be bridged, there'll be narrower. You see it, for example, in education. There was education free for all. You had the world's best education in Indian IITs, if you would make it to the IITs. Now, again, that is not a period that one sings praises about. But what has now happened, for example, is that your upper classes no longer send their children to national universities more and more. More and more, their children are going for education abroad, or they're inviting foreign universities to open campuses. So you really have what Randhir Singh used to call two nations within a nation. We really have become two nations. So neoliberalism is not just an economic policy, it's a way of life. It's an ideology, it's a way of life. It is a value system. That extreme individualism of the American kind is now the life process of the middle classes, of the upper middle classes in India. Hence that break of the compact. Now, what does happen is that, for example, in CAA or NRP, so at that time, after Shaheen Bagh, it became a national movement which brought out a lot of the middle classes. So periodically they come out, but there is no consistency and they no longer come to the left. And that has been going on actually for quite a while. So that's in brief. It is really the kind of capitalism you have under neoliberalism, of which we now have had almost 40, 45 years. So two generations have sort of grown up in this new kind of dispensation, not only economic, but also ideological, and so on. The other one was what? What was the second question?
It's to do
socialist countries.
Yes. Well, what's happening there, I would say that both DPRK and Cuba are under extreme pressure They are on bare lifeline. You see what has happened in Cuba over the last 2 or 3 weeks. In a small town away from Havana, somewhere, they managed to bring out a couple of thousand people in a demonstration for reasons absolutely justifiable. Because life in Cuba at the moment is very hard. It is very hard. Aside from the sanctions which have been going on, the blockade that has been going on since 1959, under Bush alone, there were more than 270 new sanctions against Cuba. Cuba lives under the greatest possible hardship. The fact that they survive and that they achieve what they achieve is miraculous. Absolutely miraculous. And now what has happened is that they were expecting those things to, that disaffection to grow. And in Cuba, life is hard. It is very hard. And there is reason for disaffection, extreme disaffection. It's not yesterday or day before or something. It has been a whole period. And yet what happened was that as soon as that happened, solidarity came not only from Venezuela, Nicaragua sent in whole flotilla of aid came in from Bolivia, Russian aircraft, any number of Russian airplanes landed with supplies and so on and so forth. About half a dozen countries gathered around Cuba and delivered what people were protesting about. So it's a contention. It's a contention. And Americans have the power to keep 35 countries under sanctions so far, and which include China and Russia. Same thing, relatively the same thing applies to DPR. To Korea, it's very much surrounded. It is very much, all kinds of attempts at strangulation go on. China, Russia try to help them as much as they can. China in particular, but China also has to also watch out, etc. So anyway, both of those countries are in very great hardship. Hopefully, they will survive. China is a different matter altogether, and that is something because it was so much not a part of today's discussion that I didn't even mention China. Because the fundamental fact of our time on the other side of what I have been talking about, is that for the first time in 500 years, the center of world capital is shifting from the West to East Asia. The world that was made by colonialism has been dented, is on its way to being challenged in a very fundamental way. And China is what is driving it. China has pulled, as we undoubtedly the comrades here know, China has pulled 8.5 billion people out of poverty in 20 years. Unprecedented in history. Never happened. Not even those 10 glorious years of development in the Soviet Union in the late 20s, early 30s. This was not the rate. It's a historically unique experience. It's a historically unique experience. We don't know where it is going. There are no models for it. And yet China is very careful. It is, I think, what they're saying is that we want to teach by example. And they're creating this global world system of connectivity and this, that, and the other, which will be centered on China. Something absolutely, for the first time in history, that a great Asian power, which is by some calculations already in terms of GDP, a larger economy than the United States, by some calculations in terms of price parity calculations. So China is a completely different, and Chinese technological breakthrough is of an order that is also historically unprecedented. What they are doing in areas of food production, new kinds of agricultural technology, what they are doing in terms of even ecology, is completely historically unprecedented. And their military technology in some areas, they're already ahead of the United States and so on. But unlike the Soviet Union, where all the investment had to go into defense because of the fear of war by the Western powers, the United States has a very different kind of, China has a very different kind of distribution of investments, in which the military outlays are very much put in perspective. The fundamental investments are in other areas. So China is in a different league.
We have more questions. There's Prabodh Parekh who says, collective unconscious of the large number of Indians is at home with the Pauranic mode of comprehending their lives. Is the far right exploiting that to the full extent? And there's a related question by Rakesh Kumar who says, has the RSS used the weapon of hatred primarily towards Muslims and then towards other minorities, including Dalits, to build an undeclared Hindu nation?
Well, the second one, absolutely true. And those minorities, by the way, communists are also a minority. they're as much against communists as they are against Dalits or Muslims or something. So it's not, those are not the only minorities that they're against. We are political minorities. But anyway, Puranic, I don't know. I'm not a scholar of the Purans. And, but I do know, what I can say is that RSS has been very successful in creating an alternative common sense in India. The national movement, as it is called, Gandhi Nehru Congress, Indian National Congress, the anti-colonial movement, created one kind of national common sense. You can call it consensus if you wish, but I prefer the Gramscian term. Common sense, the way you think about the world, the way you even experience the world, not think, just the way you experience the world. They have certainly succeeded in uniting vast numbers of Hindus. I don't know what population, but certainly caste Hindus, immense numbers of caste Hindus. They have certainly been able to convert. And certainly the saffron yippee has played a very important role in that legitimation of the RSS for the middle and upper classes. So that is certainly true. And they have their own. I don't know if it is Puranic. I think all these anti-modernities are actually very modern. They legitimate themselves in the name of some historical past that really never was. But they're very modern. It's a very peculiar mix, a very irrational mix. You first of all have to create a mass irrationality for people to accept the kind of combination that you make for people. But that certainly is true, that there's a kind of Hinduization of a certain sort, of a very right-wing sort, which is afraid of all these. What they're trying to do also is to keep all these so-called minorities from getting together, because if all these minorities were ever to come on the same platform, they would create a majority. As a matter of fact, Dalits and Muslims and Sikhs and etc. It's not a small number. Overall, you might get a majority. That is part of the problem, the fragmentation of society, the fragmentation of oppositions. That again has a lot to do with very successful kind of identity politics, which was always a part of Indian politics anyway. But in these postmodern times, this sense of, I fight for my own sort of thing, and you can go to hell. That sort of thing is very difficult to bring all these minorities to the same together. What else?
Then we have three questions that are kind of interrelated or connected to each other. We have Vandana Sonalkar, who says, you say that the US Republican Party and the Indian RSS are two of the most dangerous forces. But in the US, we see a mass protest building up among the young. The RSS can draw on the system of caste hierarchy and its ideology to co-opt even the classes that are hit hard by the present government's policies. Relatedly, there are two questions from Maya Pandit and Ashok Dhavle, who both say, excellent exposition. Could you kindly outline what could be the rays of hope for the future in the present dark scenario? That's Ashok Dhavle. Maya Pandit says, the picture is so bleak. Can you suggest any rays of hope in these dark times? So as I see it, they're kind of connected to each other. Vineet Tiwari says, what do you think where Indian communists can find a niche to advance the struggle for socialism? This could also be taken in this lot of questions, I guess. Shruti Tambe says, what is your comment on the cultural appropriation of the entire northeastern India by the right wing and the systematic effort to erase tribal identities and so on? This is a slightly different question, but whatever order you like.
There's a lot of questions. I'll forget about them. I have very short memory. It's getting shorter and shorter as the days go by. First, you see, we on the left read the great Marxists, who were the great figures of victory. Lenin, Mao, Comrade Ho Chi Minh, Castro. I am very much stuck with the great Marxist of defeat, which is Gramsci. So, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Pessimism of the intellect is the first premise for articulating a politics of optimism, which is also politics of realism. We could go into, other sorts of things, but my only undertaking in this particular presentation was to say what's the sort of world we live in. What is this world in which we have to think, even of the communist project, very, very differently? See, that's, for example, what the Chinese have done. What the Chinese have done is that they figured out that all the ways of building socialism, from which China gained a lot, during the Maoist period, Mao's own period, during the Cultural Revolution and so on, nevertheless could not resolve some of the very fundamental questions of building socialism in a world surrounded by capital. And how to think completely new forms of building, bases for socialism of the future. I think those are some of the things that we have to do. If I knew the answer, I would obviously share it with you. I don't, but that is what our collective project has to be. What kind of communism is now really, what is in this new, completely different kind of capitalism? You know, unless you understand what kind of capitalism you are up against, you cannot define a communism of our time. You will always be going back to quotations. To think of a communism of your time in your place is a very different kind of undertaking, but that is only possible if we properly understand what new kind of capitalism is, what new kind of ideological ensembles have been put together in India to justify it for the very large numbers of people, probably the majority of the people, etc. We have to think through all of that. If I had those rays of hope, I would have shared them. First of all, rays of hope, we can always. What else? What other questions were there? Sorry, I just keep forgetting.
Sure. So there were three questions around this whole issue of, optimism and pessimism and so on. Those you have answered. Or four questions maybe, because Vinit Tiwari also had a question about what you think where Indian communists can find a niche to advance the struggle for socialism. All of those, I guess, have been covered by your answer.
Ahmad, you have spent your life, you tell me. You have been doing it yourself. So is comrade to the end. You tell me. Who am I to tell you? You tell me.
And there's Shruti Tambe, who's asked, what is your comment on the cultural appropriation of the entire Northeast India by the right wing and a systematic effort to erase the tribal identity? So.
Right. That is something, I myself not very familiar that much with the Northeast. In any detail, I don't really go there. I do meet people from there and so on, but I watch it. You see, part of the great success of the RSS has been that it started essentially as not only a broadly Brahminical movement, but really a movement of Brahmins and related upper castes. They break through what they did understand about India is that it is a society so fundamentally fragmented in its social composition. It is the most heterogeneous society. And you have to deal with every part of the society with a sense of differentiation. So the number of fronts, for example, that they spawned, hundreds, thousands, locally, for castes, subcastes, for this, for that, etc. from a centralized place and trained people to go into those communities, go into among the Adivasis, and slowly, gradually put into their homes, ye murti rakh do, fala murti rakh do, etc. But Vanasis, I mean, you know, creating a politics that brings in an enormously varied elements of the society on a singular platform, which is fundamentally Brahmanical in nature. And yet all castes, subcastes are addressed in it. And they have been by and large very successful in this. The same thing, they have understood that there is no such thing as religious minorities. There are Muslims and there are Sikhs and there are Buddhists and there are Christians and there are Christians of the South and there are Christians in the Northeast, and etc. So they understand sociology. Let me put it that way. And they have addressed the politics of the locality with a Hinduized, upper caste Hindu sort of perspective on the top, but local, and finding people, converting people. It's very much like the old missionaries when they went to Africa and so on, even in India, but particularly in Africa and so on, where they would pick up the frictions inside the community and patronize one side against the other and create local leaders who were loyal to them and create that kind of structure. At the same time, this whole thing of schooling and popular work among the masses and so on and so forth. So I'm not really deeply conversant. I can't give really that kind of answer. But I think they have done the same thing, and the Northeast is like any other part of the country is capable of being organized on that kind of basis, where local politics, you take hold of the local politics, and you have lots of funding. You have cadre you have trained cadre to devote to it, to fund the things and so on and so forth. And their material wealth, by the way, is not a minor matter so far as their success is concerned. The backing that they have from the big and middle bourgeoisie, the immense amount of finance they have, they can go out and organize anything. They can just put in 10 whole-timers and build offices and build schools for them and this and that and so on and so forth. And next thing you know, they're followers. When you play local politics.
Comrade Uday, how much more time do we have? Because we've been going on for about an hour and 40 minutes.
Yeah, I think yes.
Maybe we should.
Unless he wants to say anything more. Yes, Aijaz साहब, आप 1.5 घंटे से ज्यादा आप हमसे बात किए हैं, और पूरे जो हमारे चिंता के जो सवाल है, जो विषय है, उसके ऊपर बहुत गहरी सोच हमारे सामने आपने रखी है. हम उम्मीद करते हैं कि हम सब लोग आज जो सुन रहे हैं, वो सब लोग इसका आपने जो बात रखी है सो सामने रखते हुए हम आगे मार्गक्रमण करते रहेंगे. सतीश कालसेकर जिन बातों से वो चिंतित थे, जिन बातों का हर दफा जिक्र करते थे और अपनी बातों के साथ, लोगों के साथ बात करते समय जिसकी चिंता हमेशा करते थे, वो सब बातें आपने अभी इसी आपके ये लेक्चर में आपने हमारे सामने रखी है। अब आपका ये इस प्रोग्राम में आपका शुक्रिया अदा करने के लिए मैं आमंत्रित करूंगा हमारे साथी श्रीपाद भालचंद्र जोशी, वो अभी आपका शुक्रिया अदा करेंगे। श्रीपाद जी,
ऐकू येत आहे तिकडे?
येते बोल.
एजाज जी, it is really a proud privilege for me to be here to express our gratitude towards you
Thank you, sir.
on behalf of Lokwangmay Griha, Kalsekar's friends, and the entire Kalsekar Parivar community. You have enlightened us and also obliged us by your presence and highly learned, much explaining much worse kind of time we are living in and its character. You have always given us an insight towards how to read and reread not only history, but the politics and culture too. You have major role in shaping our perceptions towards these things for years together. Our late friend Satish, who always remained friend and guide to many, also was sharing that. You have rightly pointed out in your frontline interview 2 years back that left in India is the only force that has a coherent vision and a comprehensive social understanding from standpoint of poor and working class, and is present in intellectual and artistic life. It was and is very much present in the works and perception of our late friend Satish, and as you pointed out, that beginning of a reconstruction of it is required. That is what you reinstated today also. Satish and Progressive Writers Association under his presidency was trying to do it even in Maharashtra for last decade through many other fronts also, like Sanskritik, Aghadi, cultural fronts, and so on. In today's India, also in this world scenario, as you explained in your talk, the sensitive people can't breathe and are forced not to utter a single word against the fascist system rules all over the world, not only in India. To breathe freely, we really need to resist. Your talk has further inspired us in this direction and reinforced the required energy within us to do so. Very kind of you for your sparing your valuable time with us. Thank you, Aijaz ji, very much, and we hope again to share with you. Thank you very much.
आप हुक्म दीजिए, जब आप कहिएगा मैं हाजिर हो जाऊँ. शुक्रिया बहुत. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
थैंक यू वेरी मच. बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया.
शुक्रिया.
हम बार बार आपसे मिलने की हमारी तमन्ना है.
जब आप कहिए, जब आप कहिए, जब आप कहिए.
Okay.
It'll be a privilege.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
आपण आता कार्यक्रमाच्या अंताकडे येतो आहोत. आजचा हा सतीश काळसेकर स्मृती जागर कार्यक्रमामधला पहिला दिवस प्राध्यापक एजाज अहमद यांच्या अत्यंत विचार परिप्लुत अशा व्याख्यानानं आज आपण त्यांची स्मृती जागी केलेली आहे. एजाज अहमद यांचं भाषण व्याख्यान आपण मराठीमध्ये सर्व श्रोत्यांना आणि वाचकांना आपण उपलब्ध करून देणार आहोत. ते आपण आपल्या समोर कालांतराने येईल. या कार्यक्रमाचा उद्या दुसरा दिवस आहे. उद्या संध्याकाळी 6 वाजता 3 ऑगस्टला संध्याकाळी 6 वाजता सतीश काळसेकर आणि लघु नियतकालिकांची चळवळ या विषयावरती एक परिसंवाद आहे. त्या परिसंवादामध्ये ज्येष्ठ समीक्षक कवी चंद्रकांत पाटील, ज्येष्ठ दलित नेते आणि कवी अर्जुन डांगळे, त्यानंतर कुमार केतकर आणि भालचंद्र नेमाडे हे उद्या सहभागी होत आहेत. सर्वांना विनंती आहे की उद्या संध्याकाळी 6 वाजता या कार्यक्रमामध्ये आपण सहभागी व्हावं अशी आपल्याला विनंती करून आजचा हा कार्यक्रम संपला असं मी आपल्या सर्वांच्या वतीने जाहीर करतो. आपण उपस्थित राहिला याबद्दल आपल्या सर्वांना धन्यवाद. ओके, अजय साहेब.